As the door opened, Barron Trump stepped out, his tall frame instantly drawing curious glances from the camp's residents. Dressed in simple jeans and a jacket, he looked nothing like the polished public figure many expected. Instead, his face carried a mix of compassion and quiet determination. A few children stopped playing, their wide eyes following his every move as he took a moment to take in the scene before him. He adjusted the strap of the backpack slung over his shoulder and took a step forward. His presence wasn't announced, nor was it accompanied by the usual entourage of flashing cameras. This wasn't a publicity stunt, it was something more personal. He had come to see for himself what no news report could fully convey. Near one of the tents, a small boy sat cross-legged on the ground, clutching a piece of paper in his hands. The drawing was crude but vivid, flames consuming a house, with stick figures standing helplessly nearby. Barron noticed him immediately and crouched down, his shadow casting a soft shade over the boy. "Hi there," he said, his voice gentle but steady. "What's that you're drawing?" The boy hesitated, glancing up with wide, uncertain eyes. Slowly, he held up the paper. "This was our home," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It burned in the fire. Now we live here." Barron took the drawing carefully, studying it with a seriousness that surprised the boy. "This was your house?" he asked, pointing to the image. The boy nodded, his small hands twisting nervously in his lap. "It was my room," he added softly. "I had all my toys there. Now, they're gone." Barron felt a lump rise in his throat but kept his expression calm. He knelt closer, meeting the boy's gaze at eye level. "I'm sorry you lost so much," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "But can you tell me more about it? Tell me everything about your home." The boy blinked as if unsure how to respond. Then, slowly, he began to speak. About the treehouse in his backyard, the nights spent playing with his sister, and the way his room used to glow with the fairy lights he loved. As he spoke, other children and a few adults began to gather, drawn by the sight of someone who was genuinely listening. For the first time in weeks, the boy's voice wasn't drowned out by the weight of loss. It was heard, and it mattered. And as Barron listened intently, his resolve hardened. This wasn't just a visit. He had to do something. Barron rose from where he'd knelt with the boy, his heart heavy, but his resolve growing. He walked further into the camp, his footsteps quiet, but purposeful. Around him, the weight of the wildfire's destruction hung in the air, not just in the makeshift tents and scattered belongings, but in the faces of the people. Each one carried a story, a life interrupted and turned upside down. Near the edge of the camp, a man sat on an overturned crate, his hands weathered and calloused from years of farming. His eyes, fixed on the ground, reflected the exhaustion of someone who had fought to hold on and lost. Barron approached cautiously. His presence met with a faint nod of acknowledgement. "You're a farmer?" Barron asked gently, noticing the soil-stained boots by the man's side. "Was a farmer," the man replied, his voice thick with bitterness. "Had a small piece of land. Grew enough to get by, maybe share with neighbors in good seasons." He gestured vaguely toward the horizon. "Now it's all ash. The land, the crops, the tools, everything." His voice faltered as he added, "Can't rebuild soil overnight. And without it, what am I?" Barron placed a hand on the man's shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "You're someone who hasn't given up yet," he said. The man looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes, but Barron had already moved on, drawn toward the faint sound of a child's voice. A little girl stood clutching her father's hand, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. Barron knelt again to her level, offering a warm smile. "Hi, what's your name?" "Emily," she whispered, barely audible. "Hi, Emily," Barron said softly. "What are you holding there?" Emily's tiny fingers uncurled to reveal a soot-covered toy, a small stuffed bear, its fur singed and its eye missing. "This is all we saved," she said, her voice trembling. Her father's grip tightened around her hand, his jaw clenched against the emotion threatening to spill. "She wouldn't leave without it," the father explained, his voice heavy with weariness. "We had to run so fast that night. The fire was everywhere. We barely got out." Barron reached out, touching the bear gently. "You were brave, Emily," he said. "And that's what matters most. You're here, and you're safe. A few steps later, Barron found himself sitting with an elderly woman who stared at the horizon, her face lined with years of strength and resilience. "I had a home," she said when he sat beside her, unprompted. Her voice was quiet, but unwavering. "I built it with my late husband. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Now it's gone." Barron nodded, sensing there was more. She turned to him, her gaze sharp and piercing. "But I don't want pity," she said firmly. "I want to rebuild, that's all." Her words hit Barron like a wave. He looked around at the faces, at the lives reduced to these fragments of survival. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the camp, he stood and whispered to himself, "I need to do something." The stories he'd heard weren't just tragedies. They were calls to action. These people didn't need sympathy. They needed hope, and Barron was determined to find a way to give it to them. The weight of the stories Barron had heard pressed on his chest as he stood in the middle of the camp. The crackling sound of the bonfire in the distance and the soft murmurs of families settling in for the evening surrounded him. But his mind raced with thoughts of how he could help. Doing nothing wasn't an option. He spotted a group of relief workers gathered around a folding table stacked with papers and clipboards. Barron approached them, his steps purposeful. One of the workers, a woman with a clipboard tucked under her arm, looked up, clearly surprised to see him. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. "I'm here to help," Barron replied, his voice steady but urgent. "What does this camp need most right now?" The woman hesitated, glancing at her colleagues. Finally, she sighed and gestured toward the table. "Everything," she said. "Food, clean water, shelter. These families lost everything. What they have here, it's barely enough to survive." Another worker chimed in, his voice tinged with frustration. "The hardest part isn't just getting supplies, it's making sure they keep coming. Donations start strong but dwindle fast. These people need more than short-term aid. They need a way to rebuild their lives." Barron nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stepped aside, quickly dialing a contact. The first call was to an old family friend who ran a logistics company. "I need a shipment of food, water, and blankets delivered here as soon as possible," he said, pacing as he spoke. "No, this isn't a favor. I'll cover it." The next call was to a tech company he knew, requesting portable Wi-Fi units for the camp to help displaced families communicate with loved ones and apply for jobs. Each call carried the same intensity, the same urgency. He wasn't just asking for help, he was demanding it. When he returned to the table, the workers stared at him, their skepticism replaced by cautious hope. "I've arranged for emergency supplies to arrive within 48 hours, Barron said, his voice calm but firm. "It's a start, but we're not stopping there." Later that evening, Barron joined the workers in packing care kits for the families. He rolled up his sleeves, working side by side with them, stuffing bags with essentials like canned food, hygiene products, and warm clothing. A displaced mother watched from a distance, her arms crossed. Finally, she approached, her expression unreadable. "You're not what I expected," she said, her tone cautious but softening. Barron looked up, brushing dirt from his hands. "I get that a lot," he replied with a small smile. "But I'm not leaving until we make a difference." The woman's lips trembled as she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. As the night wore on, Barron continued working, his determination unwavering. This wasn't just charity, it was a mission. He couldn't undo the fires or erase the pain, but he could spark hope. And as he looked around at the families beginning to smile again, he knew this was only the beginning. The first rays of dawn broke over the camp as the sound of engines echoed in the distance. Barron stood at the edge of the field, his breath visible in the cool morning air. Trucks rolled in, one after another, their cargo beds filled with supplies, food, blankets, water tanks, and even toys for the children. Relief workers and volunteers quickly sprang into action, unloading crates and distributing the essentials to the families. Barron's presence was a quiet reassurance as he moved through the camp, helping wherever he could. He handed bottles of water to elderly residents, carried boxes of supplies to families, and paused often to listen as the people shared their gratitude. A little girl with a shy smile tugged at his sleeve and held out a stuffed bear from the pile of toys. "Is this really for me?" she asked softly. Barron knelt beside her, his voice warm and steady. "Yes, It's all yours. Every child deserves something to hold on to. Nearby, construction crews began assembling modular homes, simple but sturdy structures that would provide the displaced families with a roof over their heads. The sight of the first home being completed drew a small crowd. Children watched with wide eyes as the walls went up, their excitement contagious. A mother, holding her infant close, stood at a distance, tears streaming down her face. "We'll finally have a door to close at night," she whispered. Barron walked over to her, his expression filled with understanding. "This is your home now," he said, gesturing toward the newly built shelter. "And there will be more. Every family here will have a place to call their own." Her gratitude was silent but palpable as she nodded, clutching her child even tighter. As the day wore on, the camp began to change. Children, who once played quietly with makeshift toys, now ran through the field, laughing as they chased each other with newly gifted soccer balls. Volunteers set up an outdoor kitchen, where warm meals were prepared for everyone. The aroma of food filled the air, mingling with the sound of hammers and saws as more homes were built. In the middle of the activity, a boy ran toward Barron, his small hand slipping into his. "This feels like home again," the boy said, his voice brimming with wonder. Barron crouched to meet his gaze, his heart swelling at the simple yet profound words. "That's the goal," he replied, "and we're just getting started." At sunset, Barron gathered the families together. Standing on a makeshift stage of crates, he addressed them, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Today is just the first step," he said. "There's still a lot to do, but I promise you, this is only the beginning. We will rebuild together." The families erupted into applause, their voices carrying a new energy. Hope had returned, fragile but undeniable. As Barron stepped down, his resolve deepened. He wasn't just helping to rebuild homes, he was helping to rebuild lives. And that, he realized, was the most meaningful work he could do. The transformation began subtly, like ripples spreading across still water. The once quiet camp, marked by desperation and uncertainty, now buzzed with life. Word of Barron's efforts had spread far beyond the camp, igniting a wave of generosity across the country. Trucks arrived daily, carrying everything from fresh produce to building materials. Volunteers poured in, teachers offering to tutor displaced children, doctors setting up temporary clinics, and builders lending their skills to construct homes. One morning, Barron stood by the edge of the camp, watching as the modular homes formed neat rows, each with a small garden plot in front. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, courtesy of a newly established communal kitchen. Children's laughter echoed as they ran through the field, clutching new backpacks filled with school supplies. It was a scene that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. Near the newly opened learning center, a group of children sat cross-legged on the ground, reciting their lessons with a volunteer teacher. Among them was Emily, the little girl who once clutched a singed teddy bear. She now raised her hand confidently to answer a question, her face glowing with pride. Barron couldn't help but smile as he watched her. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. A few tents down, the farmer Barron had met earlier was hard at work planting seeds in freshly tilled soil. His hands, once idle and heavy with despair, moved with purpose. "These seeds are hope," he said when Barron approached, his voice steady. "In a few months, this land will grow food again. We'll feed our families and maybe even share with others." Barron nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "You're rebuilding something bigger than just crops," he said. "You're rebuilding your future." The elderly woman who had spoken about her lost home was now tending a small garden beside her new shelter. She glanced up as Barron passed and waved him over. "Look at these," she said, holding up a handful of tiny green sprouts. "They're not much now, but they'll grow strong, just like us." Barron crouched beside her, the sincerity in her words sinking deep into his heart. "You've inspired more people than you know," he told her. As the day went on, volunteers shared stories of how Barron's actions had inspired them to join. A woman placing tiles on a new roof told him, "I saw your work here on the news and thought, if he can make a difference, so can I." Another volunteer, a retired teacher, said, "Because of you, these families have hope again." Barron paused, letting their words settle. The magnitude of what had begun here was overwhelming. He realized this was more than just a camp. It was a community being reborn. But with that realization came the weight of responsibility. He couldn't stop now. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the thriving camp, Barron stood quietly, reflecting. The journey wasn't over. There were more families out there who needed help, more lives that could be changed. This was just the beginning. "What's next?" he whispered to himself, his resolve stronger than ever. The sound of gentle chatter and laughter filled the evening air as families gathered under a large canopy set up in the heart of the camp. String lights hung between poles, casting a warm glow over the scene. The once quiet and uncertain community was now alive with hope and unity. A table laden with freshly prepared food sat at the center, surrounded by parents, children, and volunteers. For the first time since the fires, this gathering wasn't about survival. It was a celebration. Barron stood near the front of the crowd, his hands resting casually in his pockets, watching as families shared stories and smiles. His eyes lingered on the children, who darted around the tables with carefree laughter, their faces free from the worry that had once weighed them down. A little boy handed him a plate of food with an enthusiastic grin. "Try this. The kitchen made it." Barron chuckled and accepted it, his heart full as he realized how far this community had come. As the evening reached its peak, Barron stepped onto a small makeshift stage. The murmurs quieted, and all eyes turned to him. He paused for a moment, scanning the faces before him, each one filled with hope, gratitude, and strength. Taking a deep breath, he began. "When I first came here, I saw heartbreak. I heard stories of loss, and I met people who had been through unimaginable pain. But what struck me most was your resilience. You didn't give up. You inspired me to act, and together, we've built something extraordinary." The crowd erupted into applause, but Barron raised a hand gently to quiet them. "Tonight, I want to honor your strength and announce the next steps. This isn't just about rebuilding homes. It's about rebuilding lives." He gestured toward a small table behind him, where a volunteer unveiled a stack of papers. "Starting next week, we're introducing scholarships for every child here. You deserve an education that will take you far beyond these walls." Gasps filled the air, followed by cheers. Parents clutched their children tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Barron continued, his voice steady but emotional. "And for the adults, we're offering grants to help restart your businesses, find new opportunities, and regain your independence. This isn't charity. It's a partnership. You're not just rebuilding homes, you're rebuilding dreams." A young girl approached the stage, her small hands clutching a handmade card. She handed it to Barron, her voice barely a whisper. "This is for you. Thank you for giving us our lives back." He opened the card, its colorful drawings of a sun and smiling faces bringing tears to his eyes. The words inside were simple but profound. "You made us believe again." Barron's voice cracked as he addressed the crowd again. "You've given me more than I could ever give you. You've shown me the power of hope and resilience. This is just the beginning." The families cheered, their voices carrying into the night, filled with a sense of possibility. As Barron stepped down from the stage, the question lingered in the air. What would he do next? But for now, the focus was on what they had accomplished together. A community reborn, dignity restored, and a future that once seemed impossible now within reach. Months passed, and the Barron camp transformed into a vibrant neighborhood. The tents and temporary shelters had been replaced with rows of modest but sturdy homes, each one painted in cheerful colors. Flowering gardens bloomed in front yards, and children's laughter echoed from the newly built playground. The air, once heavy with despair, now carried the hum of life and possibility. Barron Trump returned on a crisp, sunny morning, his arrival greeted by excited whispers and warm smiles. He stepped out of the car and paused, taking in the sight of the thriving community. Families gathered near the entrance to welcome him, their faces beaming with gratitude. It was no longer the same place he had visited months ago. This wasn't just a camp. It was home. As Barron walked through the streets, he was greeted like an old friend. A farmer approached him first, his handshake firm and his smile wide. "Remember me?" the man asked, his voice filled with pride. "You told me I hadn't given up even when I felt like I had. Look over there." He pointed to a small plot of land where rows of crops grew. "The soil's alive again, and we're feeding not just ourselves, but the whole community." Barron nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "I told you it would happen," he said, clapping the man on the shoulder. Further down the street, Emily, the little girl with the singed teddy bear, ran up to him, her ponytail bouncing. "Barron!" she called, her voice bright. In her hand was a notebook filled with drawings of her new home, her school, and the garden her family had planted. She flipped through the pages eagerly, showing him her favorite. "This is you," she said, pointing to a drawing of a tall figure holding hands with her family. "It's perfect," Barron said, crouching to her level. "But you're the real hero, Emily." Nearby, an elderly woman knelt in her garden, planting flowers beside her front steps. She looked up as Barron passed and waved him over. "This was just dirt and ash when we started," she said, her voice filled with pride. "But now, look at it. You didn't just give us homes. You gave us the will to dream again." As the community gathered in the newly built town hall, Barron stood before them, his heart full. He looked out at the families, each one a testament to resilience and hope. "When I came here," he began, his voice steady, "I saw pain and loss, but I also saw strength and determination. You've turned that strength into something extraordinary. This community is proof that even in the face of devastation, we can rebuild, not just structures, but lives." A mother stood and spoke, her voice breaking with emotion. "You didn't just change our lives," she said. "You reminded us that people care." Barron's throat tightened as he replied, "It's all of you who have shown me what's possible when we work together. You've inspired me more than you'll ever know." As he left the neighborhood, Barron felt the weight of the moment, a profound understanding of how one act of kindness could ripple outward and change lives. His mind turned to the countless others still in need, and he knew his work was far from over. This story is a reminder of how one small act of kindness can create waves of change. Whether it's lending a hand to someone in need, donating time or resources, or simply listening to someone's story, every action matters. Take a step today to make a difference in your own community. Together, we can rebuild hope and inspire a legacy of change.